Hi, I'm Kelly Ott,
And I'm Laura Wakefield.
and today we will be talking about the smarter steps to writing IEP goals. We're going to give you some time-saving strategies and some tips to help you develop effective and compliant IEP goals. First, before we begin, we need to talk to you a little bit about some disclosures. Of course, Laura and I are the owners of S.M.A.R.T.E.R Steps, which is a consulting business for school staff and parents related to writing IEP goals. We may refer to some of our products and services in this presentation. So today we're going to talk to you a little bit about the history and definitions related to writing IEP goals and discuss with you the new grading grid for the states according to the Department of Education and OSERS. We will be reviewing the 13 federal mandates, talk a little bit about some state laws and some of our district requirements. Of course, we're going to be talking about research and introduce to you the S.M.A.R.T.E.R strategy that can help you write better IEP goals. We will go through this process and show you how to do this with some real-life samples. Okay, so as we're going through this today, I want you to think about some of your settings and some of the populations that you serve. What is your caseload like? Have you had any training on the 13 federal mandates for IEP goals? Do you know what those are? How often do you work on IEPs at home?
I do.
Every night? About how many hours a week? We also want you to think about your prioritization process. How do you determine which goals will take priority for the IEP cycle? This is an important part of the process.
It's challenging.
And then think about some of your parents. Have they been dissatisfied? Have you had formal disputes or any resolutions or due process hearings? At the end of your IEP cycles, are you still finding unmet goals, or that your students may be progressing but just haven't achieved those end lines? Those are all things we want you to think about. Okay, so a little bit about us. We have been practicing for over 50 years combined, which is kind of scary. And even though we formed S.M.A.R.T.E.R Steps a few years ago, our business really has been founded on that experience and some of the things that we have found through the last couple decades with IDEA, some of the changes.
And they're constantly changing. We have to constantly keep up, don't we?
We do. And it gets hard to keep up with those changes and to remain compliant. And I think for the most part, the most difficult thing is making sure that we are meeting the needs of our individual students. And that's becoming more challenging, I think, with higher accountability stakes. So since IDEA was first implemented, I think we were preschoolers at the time. And then really high school is where I think the first philosophies of inclusion started to be discussed.
About the mid-'80s when you and I were around juniors and seniors in high school. So
it's kind of crazy to think about what's happened since the law was initiated and all the provisions and changes over the years. So let's review a little bit about the history of special education law and some of the definitions that go along with that. I think that parts of the IDEA, in order to help you kind of dissect the IEP goals and what's important, you have to have a solid basis and foundation so you can advocate for your clients and to help them affect better goals in the long run. So really, when you think about it, let's kind of go through and see some of the basis for special ed law. Who do you think first drafted the legal concept of special education for public schools? Because when I think about the laws, I think about everything being governing for us by the schools.
Right.
Or by, the the
some
legal
agency,
system,
yeah,
right?
like some government agency or something has been driving it, and yeah.
Right. And what we found was that actually the answer is C. The mothers of special education really are the ones that started the special ed process. Katie Dolan, who's known as the mother of special education, had a son with autism way back in the 1950s. I can't even imagine what it was like for her pioneering in that. She worked really hard with 3 other mothers to draft the first laws of special education. It was passed in Washington State in 1971 and eventually passed as federal legislation a year later. And of course, other important people that were pioneers in the field include Linda Brown in the famous Brown et al. Versus the Board of Education. And she really fought for racial integration in the public schools. Another hero for special education law was President John F. Kennedy. His sister Rosemary had a cognitive disability, and he started the federal push for the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which later provided funding for primary education. This was seen by advocacy groups as really expanding access for public education for children with special needs. So these people really had instrumental parts in starting the first laws for special education students. Okay, so the next question, who do you think wrote the first IEP? I think these options are quite funny, and when you look at them, again, it may not be what you think. Parents were the first ones to write special needs IEP goals. So you think about that, after the funding and legislation were passed, schools didn't have much in the ways of guidelines for eligibility or for goal writing. And so parents started developing requests. They would send in suggestions or write them out on note paper, really, and give to the school.
Can you imagine?
And there were things like, my child will feel happy at school. My son will learn to read. I mean, I think things that parents today still really want, you know, probably revolved a lot around safety, as you can imagine. I'm just laughing at the thought of parents jotting down the goals that they would like for their kids to see.
Compared to what we have to do today with all the software and compliance forms and, you know, dot this I, cross this T. It's become a very modernized system nowadays compared to just jotting a few things down on notebook paper. I kind of long for those simplistic days, to be honest. But we have accountability issues these days, and so big changes.
Yeah, so we have a lot more stringent, detailed federal and state guidelines on what's supposed to be included in goals today, and we are going to talk about those today. All right, so think about the timeline of special education, because really the law was mandated for special education before there were special education certified programs for teachers or certified teachers even in special ed. So if you think about that for a minute, the schools were being required to provide specialized instruction to students with disabilities, but no one really had specialized training to do that.
That's crazy, and it kind of explains why I feel like we're always so far behind.
Well, and I think many of us still feel undertrained, right?
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
the whole point
That's so true.
Some of the things we're doing. So back then, the related service providers were really not working in public schools, serving children with special needs. They were working in other capacities, you know, such as separate education private facilities or hospitals, but not providers in the regular education setting. Bachelor's and master's level programs hadn't been created to that point. So the universities needed to be able to create these programs in order to fulfill this mandate. So the next question, who pushed for universities to develop special education teacher training programs? Look at these options and see. think by now you're probably seeing the trend here, right?
Pattern. Yeah.
Yeah. The parents, of course, push for children with special needs to have teacher training programs. They were working as early as the 1950s for passage of laws that provided for training of teachers who worked with students, mostly who were deaf, hard of hearing, or had cognitive disability of some sort. The universities had developed some programs for this as a result, and the University of Illinois was the first college to develop research and training programs. And that related mostly for educators and psychologists to study non-typical development in special populations. So the University of Illinois' program then was modified and adapted by other universities to evolve into the special ed teacher programs that we now have today. But if you think about that, Laura, without the lobbying from parents in the 1950s for funding for these programs and these services, there really would have been an even longer delay of services for students. And I think really we wouldn't have jobs. I mean, that's kind of hard to think about.
Exactly. And we wouldn't be able to pursue our passion of helping these children without all those legislation, training programs pushing forward.
Yeah. So thank goodness for those parents that had the insight to get this ball rolling. So again, as you see, there's the important pattern of children with disabilities. The special needs parents really have historically driven this process. They're the ones who started all of this by advocating. They've been the strongest advocates for their children. And then we want you to see that this trend will continue, because as it started in the 2015-16 school year, the state departments of education began surveying parents on their satisfaction with IEPs for their children. So this is being used in report cards on the states and possibly tied to future funding for that state. So if your clients are not providing feedback in some form to teams, then they're going to have to look at how to write up their satisfaction. You should encourage your district or your school to start surveying your parent satisfaction somehow. So Laura and I kind of started this. We were thinking about all of our clients and seeing that there were some trends. And when we talked to people, we found that of these 4 options listed here, there was one that really stood out as the hardest part of the IEP. So I think you can kind of look at that and reflect what you think the hardest part is. But we found in talking to professionals and parents that the IEP goals really was the hardest part.
Yeah. And also finding a room to fit everyone in, Kelly.
Right. Or with air conditioning or heat or
exactly.
all the other amenities that can make
a chair for everyone.
The process really uncomfortable. So in the research that we've conducted at Smarter Steps, the majority of people say that C, the IEP goals, were the hardest part of the IEP, which, we agree with this. We know that most of the day-to-day struggles on the job for special education staff stem from the IEP goals, right?
Yes, it does.
We were kind of talking about this the other day. Really, the goals are what drive the number of minutes and tell teams how much work they're supposed to be doing. Really, the minutes drive the services. All this can affect nightmarish scheduling tasks that we have in the schools, right? Trying to get those kids on the schedule. And, many of us don't realize what goes into scheduling for students unless you do it. And once you start doing scheduling, you realize how difficult it is. School staff really need to provide protected time and tools to create mindful scheduling and routines for not just the students, but for the staff developing those goals.
Exactly. And I think that leads to one of our biggest stressful burnout situations is trying to schedule all of our minutes in for kids. And I think it's also a stressful thing for parents because they don't necessarily understand all that goes into that. And they want their kids to have the maximum amount of services. So,
and it has to be realistic, and that's what we're here to talk to you about today, because if you can't get those minutes in because you're bogged down with all your other responsibilities, then everyone's suffering for that.
Exactly. And there's only so much time in the day. So, I mean, it's finite.
Absolutely. So we're going to talk a little bit about some definitions. I think it's really important that we have to remember we need to view the students from a goal-based lens. I think all too often we get sidetracked on those other duties that we were just talking about, this bus duty and all those other things that we lose focus that we're supposed to be doing. But those really distract us from what we are supposed to be doing. We've discovered that the main area of miscommunication or dispute usually centers around a poorly written goal. We believe that if IEP teams can improve this one part, it would significantly improve parent-school relationships. So remember that the focus of our day really, as a special education provider, should be on advancing that student on his or her IEP goals. Okay. So let's tackle the idea of what is an IEP. Shall we?
Yes.
We have always joked that stands for incredibly enormous paperwork, which I think anyone that has dealt with IEPs would agree that this is the case. But it really is supposed to stand for Individualized Education Program. We want to specifically narrow in on the definition of individualized as it relates to goal development. But just real quick, a note about this. We hear people talking about IEP as Individualized Education Plan, and I want to make sure that everyone understands that the legal definition or legal name of IEP is Individualized Education Program, not plan. And it may seem like splitting some hairs semantically, but I think you'll see why it's important as we go on through this discussion today. A plan means a general outline with activities that are sketched out in various details. It tends to answer the question, what will we do? Of course, there's a fair amount of planning needed to build an IEP, but in contrast, program refers to a schedule and is time-bound with specifics related to measurable outcomes. And here's the big part. Those measurable outcomes answer the question, what will be the end results? The results are going to be the focus of today's webinar because they've become significantly more important in recent years. That accountability piece is really hitting us hard. So when we discuss the concept of individualized as it relates to developing goals, we need to remember a few things. First, it should not be a cookie cutter approach. Each goal should be unique to that child and should contain customized specific skill sets that relate to their general needs. Second, those goals should change from year to year because a child should be showing some kind of change in a year. Now, we talk about progress and we want it to be progress, but reality is sometimes that change is regression. Regardless of any reason for that, there needs to be some sort of change. You cannot use the same goals from year to year. And lastly, data-driven, it has to be based on the individual child's progress or lack of progress. We have to use the data that we gather and make informed decisions on how to develop the next goal for that child. We must individualize based on the child's specific needs. When we talk about this, we kind of laugh because really, quite often what we see is that we're trying to fit the kids into whatever program or structure in the school. But ideally, that structure needs to accommodate that child's specific needs. It's kind of hard.
We've all been in this meeting with the slide is showing where everyone had their different agenda and vision. And sometimes, you know, we've lost track of what the child really needed.
Right.
So.
Okay, so all too often we get sidetracked on our day-to-day school activities. We've kind of talked a little bit about this, and we're not going to talk at length about this, but I do want you guys to understand that anything that takes away from our primary duties as special educators and shifts that focus from working on those goals really can be considered misappropriations of FAPE. If your salary is coming from special ed funds, you're mandated to provide FAPE to students with disabilities. Not bus duty, not recess duty, not after school care. I'm sure I could go on. If you're required to do those things, it could be misappropriations of federal and state funds. That's something that you need to have a serious conversation with your administrator about. We've heard the whole gamut, and we've done webinars specifically on that topic. But if you have any questions or need help advocating for your role as a special education provider, please let us know. Contact us, because this is something we can help you with. All right, so looking at a shift, if you're being asked to perform some of these non-essential duties, here are some things to consider and discuss with your administrators. If you kind of look at these, in 1997, we've shifted from access to results since then. The shift in 2004 was really related to research, evidence-based, and data informing your decisions.
And you know it takes a lot of time to gather your research evidence and your data and sit down and review that, so you got to block that time.
And in 2015 and forward, the focus on reporting results versus procedural compliance, and we'll talk about that when we go through the RDA today, really is a shift in thinking from all those process-oriented mandates and regulations that we've been bound to. Now the focus is going to be on reporting results and our students making progress on their IEP goals. So if you're not spending the majority of your day focusing on that, you're probably going to have some problems. Okay.
All right, I think I'm going to talk to you a little bit, give Kelly a break for a second. Starting in the 2014-15 school year, the State Department of Education had to start reviewing student level outcomes. And they were looking at certain populations for this. They wanted to look at preschool, alternative assessment students, and transition age and older. They were looking for high school graduates with IEPs, and were they meeting their IEP goals and their transition goals. So if you serve these populations, I want you to think about some of the things that we're going to share regarding this Department of Education assessment that they're doing. So for elementary and middle school, though, the states will be reviewing what's called state identified measurable results, which are child level outcomes. So what would those be? That could be things like your state mandated assessments that many of us have the pleasure of doing in the spring every year. They're going to be looking at how students with IEPs do on those assessments. That's one of the outcomes they might be looking at. And they're also going to look at, the grades that aren't tested. So for example, in Missouri, we test 3rd grade and up, but they're going to look at the kindergarten, 1st and 2nd grade IEPs to see if those kids met their goals. So
there's going to be different ways each state selects what their targets are going to be. All right, well, as Kelly mentioned earlier, shift happens a lot in special education. I'd say probably every year we want to pull our hair out with the latest thing that we have to do.
I think that's
right?
a shift like a swing, though. Don't you see? It just kind of goes
Yes,
back
it
and
does.
forth.
It seems like, we did this 10 years ago, didn't we?
Right.
We're doing it again? Okay. But this one is pretty significant, and we haven't done this one. So what we're going to be looking at is that shift from those process level type measurements to outcome measurements. And this is a framework called the Results-Driven Accountability, or RDA for short. And if your school district has not in-serviced you on this yet, you need to talk to them about it, because it's been going on for about 4 or 5 years, and it will most likely continue for another few years. You can also go to the U.S. Department of Education government website to learn more on it. So this RDA shift started gathering baseline data in the 2012-13 school year, and they were using a rubric like we're used to seeing with our kids. Well, the U.S. Department of Education has been using it on you in your school districts, and they've been looking at different types of data that we mentioned, and they discovered that only 15 states in the United States met the criteria for what they were looking at on these IEP goals and outcomes on standardized testing.
And that was in the very first year, right? 2012-13.
Right. So, this was just gathering the information. Where are we looking at outcomes just in the beginning without any type of interventions or changes yet.
But think about that. We kind of joke about it because we know that year, the sampling year, they were able to, states were able to sample whatever districts they wanted.
Yes, they were allowed to report whichever ones they wanted. So that's also interesting, because you would assume they chose their best districts. Their districts had the best
She says
outcome.
Interesting, I say sad.
And yet, even choosing their best districts, only 15 states met criteria. Our state, Missouri, was one of them, which shocked us a little bit, to be honest, because as an advocate and as Kelly works in many districts, we've seen a lot, and it's shocked us that
we see all the problems. So
right,
we were surprised.
We have a skewed sample, true, but apparently we met the criteria, and we're going to talk a little bit later about why we had an advantage, why our state has an advantage on that, and it's what led us to developing the S.M.A.R.T.E.R STEPS goals. So here is the map of that data, and if you want to take just a quick second to locate your state and see where you are, if you have green, that means you're meeting criteria. And what the yellow means that there were some areas that needed assistance, and the red areas were ones that needed intervention. And so what happens if you need intervention? Well, if you need intervention, so if your state's in the red for several years, that could lead to some issues. So they took the data for 5 or 6 years now, and states change. They shift from green, yellow, red. However, some states are hitting those 3 and 4 year in a row of red.
They've added a new color, right?
Yeah, they added gold. Gold doesn't mean good in this case.
Gold needs intervention for 2 or more consecutive years.
Right. Yeah. Which will result in those states having to enter a compliance plan with the federal government, and ultimately, if they don't meet all the requirements in that compliance plan over a few years, they will have a portion of their federal funding withheld. So this is serious outcomes. I mean, we already don't have enough funding to exist and run the programs, so you can imagine how difficult it will be if your state is not meeting the requirements and having even more funding withheld.
Well, think about it. If they're already not meeting it and they lose funding, how are they ever going to get out of the red?
Exactly. that doesn't seem to solve the
Yeah.
problem in our minds, at least, right? It seems like they would need more assistance, more funds, right? Okay, another quiz time. Why would there be a shift all of a sudden from process? You know, process was, oh, we got our evaluations done in 60 days. We got our IEPs done in 30 days. We did child find correctly and sent out all our notices, things like that. Those were process. Why would all of a sudden we would shift to results-driven accountability? What would cause that?
Well, and let's be clear on that. We're still bound by all those procedural things,
True,
right?
right.
But as far as our state compliance, we still have to remain compliant under those procedural guidelines for our state. But OSERS now is adding additional requirements and accountability with regard to outcomes.
Which, believe it or not, they have never looked at that. This past 5 years is the first time they have ever looked at outcomes. Isn't that interesting?
It is.
So why did they shift all of a sudden? Let's think about this. Was it push from parents? You know, that's been the past pattern that we talked about.
Which I'm sure there has been. We know just with the legal issues that have come up over the last 5 years, there's been more push from parents for better outcomes.
Right. Or was it the low NAEP scores for reading and math for IEP students, low alternative assessment outcomes for IEP students, and low graduation rates of IEP students? Or do you think it was all of the above?
I think those are all problems.
And you are correct. It was all of the above. So when you take all of that information together, you have to really have an honest conversation with yourself and say, we are not meeting the goals for these students. Another important part of the RDA rubric that Kelly mentioned earlier is that parents will be reporting if schools facilitated parent involvement and that parent involvement improved their child's outcomes. So again, we're having that important piece of the team, which is the parent. Parent satisfaction is going to be the name of the game moving forward. So, okay, so ridiculous question time. Why would parents want results, Kelly? What do you think?
I mean, parents of children with special needs want all the same things that any parent wants.
Exactly. Same thing everyone wants. Same thing you and I want for our own children, right?
Absolutely.
Best possible education outcomes we can have. So I've attended now, I'm at 3,100 something IEP meetings. Can you believe that? And that's been over 20 years. And what I've noticed is that IEP teams don't know how to develop goals. And I was part of that problem in the past too. I didn't have the training. I just kind of did whatever someone told me to do in the past, and I never sat down and really looked at what's required. So, but I really do believe that my students were making progress. I just couldn't necessarily develop it and explain it in the best way.
Yeah.
Would you say?
I would say
similar?
that's true.
Yeah.
Sometimes we forget what we're doing and why we're doing it, but we know that we're doing it and it's right for the kids.
It just sometimes doesn't reflect on those goal pages.
Right. Our documentation doesn't always reflect that we're doing what we need to do.
We set ourselves up for a trap, which we're going to talk about in a minute. So let's take a quick tour of those federal mandates. There's 13, and we are going to show you a little bit of the language of the law, which is kind of boring, to be honest with you.
Yes, we're going to zip through it pretty quick, but you do need to know it.
So prepare. I'm going to kind of speed, but then we're going to break it down into something a little bit more manageable called the Smarter Step system.
So just an aside here, real quick. One of the things that Laura and I kind of joke about is we didn't know that there were 13 federal mandates related to IEP goal writing. We learned through researching some of our own problems in our own districts. And when we discovered this, we realized that we had never received any of this training, not in our grad programs, not in our first jobs, not in our practicums. Still to this day, there are very few programs out there teaching professionals that there are 13 federal mandates related to IEP goal writing. And I think it's pretty important for us to know because it's our license at stake. We are responsible, we are accountable. Just because we don't know those mandates doesn't mean we're not responsible to adhere to them.
Kind of like when I might accidentally go over the speed limit. And the speed limit is posted. I can't just say, sorry, officer, I didn't know. Now don't give me a ticket, right?
Right.
It's the same thing here.
So sometimes they're a little redundant, I have to warn you. You know how special education things are. One of the problems that Kelly and I noticed when we started doing research on this is that many of the state model forms that a lot of your school districts base their IEP forms on are missing really important prompts that you need that prompt you on these mandates. So that was the first issue that we noticed. So let's go into the next part. The first requirement is that you need to consider the specific area of need for the student. This is supposed to include academic and developmental functional needs of the child. So when districts say to parents, oh, we only have to look at academics or grades, they're forgetting the other two parts, the developmental and functional.
And I think that the actual law doesn't even use the word academic, right? It's educational.
It does. It just says educational setting or educational.
Which really isn't just about the academics. Educational is about the entire education of that child.
Right. So this is where teams are legally allowed to prioritize goals. But that part of the discussion sometimes gets omitted in meetings, and we think we have to create 127 areas. And yes, there are some children that have many areas of need, but as a team, you are legally allowed to prioritize. And I think this is step one of gaining back some of your sanity and time management. Okay, so the second and third requirements mention specific needs again, except this time it is referring to any other educational needs that result from the disability. So this is where related services come into play. But also we have the concept of measurability playing into the equation now. The fourth requirement, the specific needs are expanded further to include alternative assessments with benchmarks and short-term objectives. The fifth requirement, how refers to your evaluation system and the data that you will be gathering. This is so important because teams often forget to put baselines and data collection frequency intervals and even sometimes the criteria of mastery. So without all of those pieces, it's going to be very difficult to measure your goals.
Or to document progress.
The sixth requirement involves periodic evaluations of the data being reported at certain intervals determined by the team, but it needs to be at least as often as report cards. The communication in this section is referring to the parent communication. And the part of the law cited here will specifically state communication to parents and guardians. Requirements 7, 8, and 9 are the big ones that teams need to show major improvement on. It's the research and evidence-based requirements for special education, related services, and supplementary aids. It must be documented somewhere. Now, some teams don't want to document it on their goal pages, but we highly recommend that you document it somewhere, even if it's just in a separate file or as an attachment to your IEP documentation.
You have to show the documentation trail.
And you know, this has been a requirement since 2004.
Right.
And we hardly ever see school districts documenting the way they should. And we're now seeing our first due process cases over this issue, and parents are winning, and then they're able to move their children to other private day schools or get outside tutoring with evidence-based models, and districts are having to pay for that. So it's really important that you're documenting. Almost done, guys. Stick with us. Requirements 10, 11, and 12 relate to the goal being attainable and relevant to the general education curriculum and participation with non-disabled peers. This refers back to context, which ties to the specific skill sets again, as we mentioned earlier. Requirement 13 is on transition. Transition services are focusing on the same ideas that we've mentioned before, specific, measurable, attainable, research-based. But for the relevance piece, it needs to be employment or pertaining to the post-secondary education and independent living skills instead of just the gen ed curriculum.
So back to the educational, not
right.
just the academic.
Right, good point. Okay, so 13 mandates is a lot to remember.
Yes. Yes.
And there were a lot of legal mumbo jumbo there in tiny font. So how are we going to remember that? We're supposed to have less stress, right? And this is supposed to be some tricks to help us. But how can we do that if there's all that information to dissect when looking at a goal? And we completely agree. So we needed to develop a memory device. Mm-hmm. And we rely on our handy dandy mnemonics to do that. So remember when we talked about earlier when we were looking at the map that Kelly and I were surprised that Missouri was in the green? But what we learned was that our state, which has, I guess, been green for 5 years in a row, mm-hmm. Has a special little trick built into our compliance standards. And we use something called SMART goals. And that's a business model for setting goals, which is fascinating. It's used by Fortune 500 companies. They've been using it for decades. And we noticed that our state's model form tries to embed that, although it was lacking in a few places. Mm-hmm. But that's what got Kelly and I started on the whole idea of let's use a mnemonic, let's use SMART goals, but let's tweak it a little so that it includes all 13 mandates in expanded to SMART-E.R. So Kelly's going to walk you through the SMART-E.R process.
Okay. So yes, we took that SMART acronym and you can see here the strategic, my eyes, I'm getting old. Measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. And like Laura said, these have been used for decades in the business world and other arenas. But for some reason, our State Department had the wisdom to add them into our compliance manual, which is great. But we realized that it just wasn't all-encompassing. We needed to add the elements missing to make them federally compliant. So let's talk a little bit about specific. It's really important when we look at the language we use in our goals, the first thing we need to do is focus on a specific skill or skill set. We need to use specific action verbs instead of saying generic things like student will improve, student will increase. Those are generic. They're not specific enough as to what we want the child to gain. It's very important. So if you look at this picture here, it's not just a dog in the water. It's a Weimaraner catching a frisbee in his mouth in the Pacific Ocean. That's very specific, right? Now why? Why do we need to do that? Well, a specific goal, for one, is easier to communicate to other people, right? I mean, increase is just so vague. We don't really know what that means. Even if you have baselines, what in criteria for mastery, what is the specific skill set we want that child to attain? A specific goal has a much greater chance of being accomplished than a general goal. So I kind of laugh. We talk about, Laura and I have goals for ourselves all the time, but something as generic as getting into shape looks so different for each individual. And I think that if I say, I just want to get in shape this year, there's no accountability. There's not specific outline as to how I'm going to do that. And it makes it easier for me to kind of fudge on it and not do it.
Right. And the word get in shape is so non-specific, like, hey, I might turn into a snowman. Like, what are you going to turn
Right.
into there? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But a specific goal might say, Kelly will join a health club and work out 3 days a week to lose 10 pounds in 4 weeks. Now that's going to hold me a little bit more accountable to trying to do it. As we saw earlier from the federal and state mandates, goals must address the underlying deficit by targeting a specific skill set or behavior. Now that's really important. Let me say that again. The federal and state mandates require that goals must address the underlying deficit by targeting a specific skill set or behavior. That is the very first requirement in those 13 mandates. The second part of the acronym, M, stands for measurable, and I think it's important to establish some concrete objective criteria for measuring progress towards the attainment of whatever goal we are setting. When we measure progress, we tend to stay on track, of course, and reach our targets, the dates and the targets, and we gain motivation to continue our work and our efforts towards mastery of that goal. So measurement, I think for a lot of us is kind of hard. We get stuck in the percentage trap, and we just want to do that because I think it's, in a lot of ways, we think it's easier, but percentages are not always the way to go for every skill set. One of the things we could do to help ourselves is we can ask questions such as how much or how many? How will I know when it's accomplished? It's important to remember that the more specific your goal is, the easier it is to think about measuring.
Yes.
You can think about the end product. What am I looking for in the end? What should it look like when it's achieved? A goal that merely states child will demonstrate age-appropriate vocabulary would be a nightmare to measure, right? And we're kind of setting ourselves up there. How do we measure that?
Right.
How can we make that goal more specific? So the measurement piece really starts with making our goals as specific as we can. Another note about measuring goals is that the measurement and the annual goal should be in language that parents and teachers can all understand. Kind of universal. Need to think about universal language. Remember, it has to be a behavior that you can see and you can count. It has to be an easy way to explain to parents and teachers what you're wanting them to achieve and how you're going to keep track of that progress. So I always think about, can I see it?
Yeah.
Can I count it? Can I measure it? Again, avoiding terms such as will improve, will increase, and will decrease. They're too subjective. They're not specific enough. And I think that we get stuck in doing that. We set ourselves up for failure because how are we going to measure that? I mean, this is where Laura sees a lot of her problems in our advocacy work. People set up situations that are too difficult to track.
And the parents that I work with on advocacy, I would also say that whole, make it something that they understand. And you'll discover that if you put it in language they understand, it does get easier to come up with a better measurement. And the kids end up meeting their goals, and then you have less dispute.
Right. Well, and the parents are more comfortable because they do understand it. They're not feeling like someone's just spewing things at them. They can take more active role in that process for sure. So so if it looks good on paper, but in reality it's not practical, we're probably not going to want to do that in our day-to-day use for measuring a student's goals. I want you to think about other ways to measure besides percentages, because there's a lot of them. Maybe for a specific skill set, there's more appropriate ways to measure those situations, like portfolios or rating scales, rubrics. We've mentioned a few here, but you can kind of think about your own. We do discuss this at length in another webinar on how to measure specific skill sets. Okay. A, of course, is for attainable. When you identify goals that are most important for the student's progress, of course, you begin to figure out ways to make them come true. Most goals can be attained when you plan your steps wisely and establish a time frame that allows you to carry out those steps. For example, we see a lot of issues with setting goals that are not attainable. There's a lot of attainability factors. Again, another webinar, but you need to be considering certain things that could be barriers. Maybe there's complicating conditions or illnesses or lots of absences. Maybe that student has had similar successes or failures in the past, and you can kind of see patterns there. Has that child had a history of regression? What's the nature or severity of the disability? Those are all important factors. In the end, we need to remember that in a typical school year, if you're seeing students for about an hour a week, that averages out to be at max 36 hours of intervention. So you need to go back and look at whatever you're working on. What is the typical progression? What are the expected outcomes in 36 weeks? Because if you have a student that's at a 0 or 10% baseline and you're wanting them to get to 80, 90, 100% in 36 hours, is that realistic? And I laugh because we talk about 36 hours, but those of us that work in the schools know that may actually in reality only be about 30 hours by the time your students have birthday parties and field trips
assemblies and they were sick
and
the flu outbreak, and it cuts those weeks down to 30 weeks.
Right. All those things that come up in the school year. So really attainability is something I think that we gloss over quite often, but it is something we need to be considering when we're developing those IEP goals. If it's not realistic, that child's not going to meet those goals, and we're setting everyone up, ourselves included.
Exactly. I think the A part of this is the reality check.
Right.
Including, again, like I said, when advocating with parents, they also need that reality check. I talk to them about, listen, we've only got about 35 weeks, so let's be realistic here about what small chunk we're going to hit for this IEP cycle.
Absolutely. Okay. And then the research. Of course, the federal IDEA law mandates that teams use and report research and evidence-based practices to ensure that our services are efficient and effectively delivered. This is one of the most challenging aspects, I think, for teams because, and I think it was eye-opening for myself, for sure, as a practitioner. I know what works for me, but thinking about, oh gosh, what was the specific research behind that? I had to go back and really do some checking on some of the techniques that I use, even to remember what those techniques are called. I've used them for so long.
Right. They just become automatic to you. You forgot the name of it, even though you use it every day.
There's some great resources out there, searching just the research literature. I know this is something that Laura and I talk a lot about. The average practitioner just does not have the time or the availability, the opportunity to go back and do ongoing research and literature reviews. So this is something that you have to find some crafty techniques and strategies to help you keep up to date on things. One thing that we found is really trying to go through and start a database of the most common strategies that you use. The other thing we laugh about is that when we are working with a student and we inherit a goal, and you guys have all been there, I'm sure, and you read that goal and your first thought might be, oh my gosh, what in the world does that even mean? Because maybe it's not specific enough or you don't know how they've measured it. But sometimes we also don't know how are the previous professionals helping that student attain those goals. We're very good at writing our goals as to what the student will do, but what are we doing? What are the instructional strategies and the techniques that we are using to help that student achieve that success. If they could do it without our help, they wouldn't need an IEP.
Right.
So we are accountable for reporting what intervention, what specialized instruction strategies are we using to help that student learn those specific skill sets. These are the things that you need to be researching. Another tip is to maybe look at developmental norms. Sometimes it's not about the strategy, but it's about where they should be at that age and developmental level. So just some things to think about. Again, we have a complete webinar in our series on the research and evidence base, and we give a lot of tips and strategies to help you with that part of the process. The next part of the acronym is teachable, and this kind of really, in my mind, is out of order. I mean, obviously we need it smarter, but here we talk about what are the teachable strategies, the instructional strategies that you're using to help that child overcome any difficulties or gain a skill, right? When writing goals, you can identify specific strategies and instructional methods. It's useful because first it helps provide specific instructional strategies that can help break down goals into incremental parts, right? Those incremental units of learning. If you go back and look at some of Marzano's instructional strategies, you see some of the awesome techniques that can be used. It also makes data keeping and progress reporting easier and I think clearer. It just kind of makes sense. It can also help show the developmental progression towards a goal, right? I mean, you're thinking about when you're documenting those incremental steps. And lastly, it helps other IET members see what strategies you're using. I kind of laugh about that because I had a student one time that would come to me and I could get him to do things, and the special ed teacher swore that he was not doing those things for her. And I ended up video recording how I was helping him and the prompt fading strategies that I was using with him and demonstrating that he could do these skills. And when she saw that, it was all very eye-opening for her because it wasn't about what the student could or couldn't do. He could do the skill. It was about what techniques were being used to help him accomplish those and the things that he specifically needed. And once she had that, he was, applying those strategies and those skills across settings. But it's very important that we are communicating as professionals how we are obtaining some of those specific skill sets.
And that's a great example of a data collection technique using video recording, because it also helps in IEPs to show that to parents, because they don't necessarily understand how you're getting their child to do those certain skills. And when they see how you're prompting and the techniques you use, it clicks for them, and then they can carry it over at home too.
Just one quick note, and I'm sure many of you know this, it's really a good idea not to name specific programs or therapy materials or other highly expensive items in your goals, because in doing so, then the district becomes responsible for purchasing and providing those resources. So, you don't want to name specific reading programs, but maybe the type of research evidence-based program, like an Ortho Gillum strategy or something, instead of the specific reading program. All right, E is for evaluate and communicate to parents. I think this is kind of funny. I was jotting down, hopefully you guys aren't using telepathy. You have some formalized way. Teams need to take time to evaluate, of course, that data at regular intervals, and really those intervals should be discussed somewhere in your goal. And while some teachers or therapists keep daily logs, others do biweekly checks. Hopefully you're doing something at a regular interval, or at least a designated interval, I guess is how we should say that. Some people don't like to do it, but if you're just doing random checks here and there, you may not be gathering data that is reliable and representative of the child's true ability, right? plus we want to have objective means of reporting, tracking and reporting data. I think when we just give judgments about progress, that opens us up to scrutiny and liability. And I think it decreases the parents' perceptions about the effectiveness of our services, our professional levels. A little planning and organization can help teams develop really good, effective communication with parents. And I think that helps build trust in the long run and relationships. So think about that. And then the last piece, R, is for relevancy. You know, this is something that has become increasingly important. We talked a little bit earlier about the academic impact, but really goals have to be aligned with not just the academics, all of the educational curriculum, transition curriculum, the alternative curriculum of your state, the students' transition, post-secondary, or independent living. It's important that you access your state's curricula for these areas and you are aware of what your district uses. In Missouri, we no longer have to use Common Core, so it's up to each district to determine what they want to use. For me, that could be a nightmare because I go to multiple districts, so I have to really keep current on, you know, not only which curriculum that district is using, but specific elements of that curriculum. So I have to know multiple curriculums for what I do. All right, so we're going to take a few minutes here, and we're already at an hour. We have a couple goals that we do want to go through and just demonstrate really quickly for you how to use the S.M.A.R.T.E.R acronym. This is one of our favorite don't do goals. This was a real example. The goal just said feelers, one word, that was it. And we kind of laugh. Obviously, it's not a S.M.A.R.T.E.R. It's not even a S.M.A.R.T. It's not even a real goal.
Now, was this one you inherited, though?
Yes, it was one I inherited, for sure.
So it was a real one you received one time on an IEP. It just said feelers on the goal page.
It did. Yes, absolutely. So obviously, we can see lots of problems with this one word goal here. It's definitely not going to be compliant. And so we can also see, here's another example. It's a common goal that we typically see too when I go to schools. This student, we'll just name her Dorothy, lives with her aunt and uncle in Kansas. She suffered a mild head injury in a tornado and has speech concerns due to dysarthria, which is, of course, a motor weakness issue. For the first area of concern, the team decided that Dorothy should have a speech goal. They wrote, Dorothy will increase speech intelligibility to 70% across all school settings. So let's go through the S.M.A.R.T.E.R acronym and kind of see how this would fit in, how we can make this a more compliant goal. When I first look at this, I'm not sure what level of speech we're talking about here. Is it the word level? Is it sentence? Is it phrase? Is it conversational? And I'm unsure of the context across all school settings. It's really not specific enough.
I would be terrified to measure that,
right? How are we going to measure this? So, I mean, right away, you should be asking yourself a million questions about this goal as it's written. We actually kind of laughed about this one because Laura and I have actually written goals like this in the past. This was the go-to format that we learned in grad school. And I think that, you know, when we look at it further, it's just not aligned with federal and state expectations. So we have to beef this up a little bit. So here is a S.M.A.R.T.E.R version. Right away, you're probably feeling a little terrified at all the info on the slide. But stay with me because we'll show you what it's going to look like when we plug it into the state compliance form. So if we look here, we can ask ourselves, is this one measurable? Yes. It is measurable. Notice that we did not use the typical percentage, but we use intelligibility rating. And the classroom teacher can actually rate that child's discussions or speech productions during discussions during the classroom learning. So we would look at this and say, is this attainable in a year? Would you see some steady incremental progress from December to May? It seems like the student is well on our way to achieving this goal. Then we would look at, is it research-based? Well, there is a reference here to the type of carryover strategy that a teacher can use with the visual cue station. So that's an evidence-based practice that is effective. In the teachable therapy and cues, we discussed with that cue station, is it evaluating and communicate to the parents? Yes. There will be evaluations of the data every 6 weeks, and these will be communicated to the parents by email. And finally, is it relevant to the general education curriculum? Yes, it states that this aligns with the 6th grade ELA Common Core Standard on Speaking and Listening. So you can kind of see, it's a lot of words on this slide, but let's look at it on the next slide. Okay, so now you see that it's all that information is plugged into this Missouri model form. And again, we had to go in and add some things here because there wasn't anywhere on this model form to document baseline or relevancy and some other, the research. But as you can see, we added them in. Even most of our computer programs have a space where we can add something. So I think that's really important for us to kind of remember.
Don't get confined by your boxes on your forms. You can add these different requirements in those spaces or in the notes section or comment section on your forms.
Okay, so that was a speech one. Here's a goal that we tend to see in IEPs quite a bit. We see some version of this goal on a daily basis. We consider this a don't do example.
It's kind of my pet peeve, honestly.
Right. We really want to avoid talking about students performing certain levels on assessments or certain level grades on a test.
Student will have a C average in math.
Right.
Stuff. Yeah.
This is just a bad idea for so many reasons. In this case, this student's issue is written expression at how they will attain a certain score on a probe. So looking at this, I don't know, I'm sure many of you are nodding your heads or thinking about this, or maybe you've even seen it in your district or do this. This is not a specific skill set. I mean, one of the things that I see a lot with reading and writing is that what if they don't achieve that grade level or that score? Have you lost an entire IEP cycle because you have not been addressing the specific skill sets to achieve that? Yes, we all want our students to be on grade level, but the whole point of an IEP is individualized education program to help that student achieve some level. So it is a specialized instruction area, not something that all the students are already taking.
Right. In this district, for example, everyone takes the Ames Web. It's something that all the kids do. So it's not necessarily anything specialized.
Right.
You know.
Yeah. So how is he going to attain that score? What are the specific skill sets? What's the individualized learning that's going to take place for him to achieve that? That's what should be written as the goal. The special education teacher or the SLP is going to teach him to score an 8th grade level on a test.
That sounds like we're teaching to the test.
Right. So we have to go back and address the underlying deficits, the underlying skill sets that's going to help him make this achievement attainable. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So for example, let's say he was struggling with some type of phonological awareness underlying deficit that was affecting his spelling, which then, you know, he has struggles in writing because of his spelling. So that would make sense that you would do a goal for that specific target.
Right. It's likewise with reading. If they're having trouble with inferencing or reading comprehension, you need to look at the basic skills under that reading comprehension to see where he is and what he needs to be working on. So here we have changed that goal and written it more into a smarter method. Of course, this student was an 8th grader with TBI and struggled with written composition. He also tended to refuse all writing tasks. I'm sure you've never seen that, right? Recently, he used a dictation app for 4 trials to produce 1 to 2 run-on sentence responses. His speech was rushed and some of the words were not reflected accurately in the dictation app. Of course, we've seen that. The teacher could not tell where sentences were starting due to missing punctuation and capitalization. So there were problems with that. So we kind of changed this to Aaron will achieve a score of 10 on the writing checklist across 3 consecutive writing tasks by the end of the IEP cycle in his ELA class when provided with dictation support and prompt fading. Data will be gathered every 6 weeks and emailed to parents. Related services, the SLP will support the school by teaching pacing strategies. The OT will support this goal by teaching sequencing strategies for learning, keyboarding, text features of the voice dictation app to help the student add capitalization and periods. The OT will also teach grasp strategies for the stylus. So there's multiple people working on this goal. I don't know if that's something that you guys deal with, but really everybody should be working on the goals.
Right.
We get asked questions about how to use the S.M.A.R.T.E.R acronym with alternative assessment students who need benchmarks. And this is going to be a little bit of that information. So you can see how we have the long-term goal at the top, and then we list out the benchmarks underneath. So one of the ways you can do that is in your long-term part, you can say achieving 3 out of 3 of the benchmarks below, or achieving 1 out of 3 or 2 out of 3 if you want to give yourself some flexibility. So this is just an example for you to look at how we lay that out.
You know, and I don't know about you, but people ask me this all the time. I almost always write benchmarks, even though I address a specific skill. And the reason I do that is because I want parents to see specifically what I'm working on. I want other professionals to see specifically what I'm working on and what I think this child needs to achieve in order to reach that overall goal. It's just an accountability piece. Since I'm contract in districts, I'm not there all day for someone just to come and check with me and ask me questions. Anyone should be able to pick up my IEP and know exactly what I am doing with that child, what tasks, what daily skills I'm addressing.
And the parents I work with love to have short-term objectives, and I think it just helps you map things out a lot easier in your school year.
Right.
But it's a good point you bring up in that the federal and state laws say that alternative assessment students must have benchmarks. They are mandated to have benchmarks. But guess what? Other kids can have benchmarks too.
Yeah,
They're allowed to have them. And I think that gets misinterpreted sometimes because I have been in meetings where we suggest a benchmark for a student who doesn't have alternative assessment. And the teams kind of freak out and say, oh, we can't do that. They're not alternative assessment. Yes, you can do that.
You can.
And you will find that it's one of those time savers that you put it in on the front end, it will save you time during the school year.
It's, I feel, best practice, really.
I agree with you. Yes. All right. So our next one is the same student we were just referring to, and you can see how we've listed out the evidence base here on using some different types of alternative assessment. and AAC tied with it. Also, the progress monitoring is reported there, and it talks about how this goal aligns with this district's alternative achievement standard.
What's missing? What's missing?
Baseline.
Yep.
It's going to be hard to know
if
this child achieved it if the baseline isn't there. All right, here is an example of something we frequently see. Some version of this has been sent to us from multiple states, and it says Jaden will complete one-step commands with no prompts, 70% of opportunities in the special education setting. We want you to look at this goal and see if you can pick apart some of the things that are missing. So some of the issues that we notice were the phrase with no prompts. That probably means independently, so it's easier to write it that way, I think. Another challenge is when you say 70% of opportunities. That gets a little bit subjective as well, and you might want to define what an opportunity is, and that will help you gather your data a little bit easier. Also, another question is this an average of 70% over so many data collection days, or are you going to require 70% in consecutive data collection days? Those are two different processes. And finally, what techniques are being used here? So there is a way to address these types of goals where you're doing a lot of prompting, and that is something that we call a prompt fading goal. And really in special education, related services, any type of intervention, I think that's really what we are. We're sort of prompt fading masters. That's what we do. And so this template that we've developed can really help you with setting up those types of prompt fading goals. And you can pretty much plug in any type of thing here. You can choose the number and the task and the skill. What's the frequency interval going to be? We listed our prompt fading evidence base here. And you can talk about what goal area this supports in your general education curriculum, or if you have other relevancy issues. So we're going to show you one where we just kind of plugged in a PT goal, for example. So we took that template, and you can see this is a physical therapy type of goal where we put those skill sets in. Here's what our form looks like. You can see this product on our website, and this is the prompt fading data tracker. You can use different types of ways to track here. You can list your activity and the date and circle your different types of prompts, and this is how you would calculate that independent level.
This is a great tool for a lot of my schools, because I do go to several schools and just supervise implementers. So I set up the therapy plans and I write the IEPs, and I even assist in the daily activities that they do with the kids. However, they're providing the services and keeping track of that child's progress. So this is really a nice tool for them, and then I can review it when I go in. However often I go in and supervise the implementer and track the kids' progress, and then I could pull the kids and check their progress and see where they are independently along those prompts.
Implementer is a Missouri term. It's kind of like a speech therapy assistant.
Yeah, kind of.
But also, I've seen this being used by paras who've been trained on how to take some data inside classroom settings so that you can look at that generalization of the skill set in different activities or context. So it's great because everyone is literally on the same page, tracking this information, and you can see how a child is doing. And then you can
compare too, because maybe a student's more independent with one person or in one setting or for one task as opposed to others. So it's really good way to keep some information.
So Kelly's going to summarize with you, why do we need to know all of this information?
Well, I'm hoping that you have received most of these messages through the course of this webinar, but really I always think about educating yourself as a way to really cover yourself and really make sure that liability-wise you are not going to put yourself under scrutiny.
Yes.
And I think that we have to understand the Andrew SCOTUS case, and really there's no more de minimis mindset. We have to be have to set higher standards and be more accountable, because our students must be achieving instead of barely passing.
Exactly.
You know, there's going to be more accountability on those measures. It also is going to relate to future funding, and that depends on us and what we're doing on a daily basis with our students. Special education is not generally working at its best capacity, so you know, we have to look at that and see what can we do to improve. Any other thoughts about that?
Well, and I just want to add on the funding thing. We just don't have enough funds to run it, and what we do have, we want to protect for sure.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that this RDA is doing is looking at that data and saying, are our dollars bringing us the outcomes that we want?
Mm-hmm.
And we really need to beef up those goals and make them align better with what we're doing and show those outcomes, and that special education can benefit these students and can make a difference.
Right. And I think you hit the nail on the head. The outcomes, you know, our main purpose for everything we do is the outcomes. And, you know, the federal government is now in alignment with that, and they are looking at outcomes too. Essentially, we want the same things. We just have to figure out how to get there. And the S.M.A.R.T.E.R strategy was designed to help us affect better outcomes for our students. So if you're wanting more information, you can go and look at our book. It is available on Amazon and other places on our website. You can also use our professional development plan. We have a really nice written professional development plan at the end of our book, so that you can take that to your administrator at the beginning of the year and say, this is what I want to work on this year. And all the webinars can outline and assist you, and it's already there for you, that development plan and the schedule and everything. So you just need someone to sign off on it and you're good to go.
It's great, because I used to hate writing those, and now we've taken all of our
experience of developing those, put it in one simple book, and it's all done for you.
Yeah, we've tried to make this as easy as possible, because we really want everyone to get on board and do the best we can for our students.
And it's short readings, you guys. So.
Yeah, it's short readings. Short. Our other resources available, of course, check out our website, and we do have an app that's going to be coming out with website membership. We have quite a few benefits. You do get routine webinars on all these topics, a newsletter with some live chat topics that we will be discussing and meeting.
You get to talk to us and ask all your IEP questions. We'll even help you write goals right there.
The app is part of the membership as well. You will get that. Other than that, we have templates and worksheets and a blog on our website. Of course, the professional development plan and other seminars that we would be willing to come to you or to meet with you online, but certainly come to the school and discuss school-wide a movement.
Or special education PTAs, whatever you want to do, we're ready to set it up with you.
And then there's always consultation on the side. If you're needing some specific assistance, just contact us for that. These are some of the places that you can see us and find our information. Please join us on Facebook at Smarter Steps and check out our Teachers Pay Teacher store. Contact us with any questions you may have. We appreciate everything that you do for children with special needs. Thank you for joining us today.